Good morning, everybody. We'll just get started in a moment. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar where we're going to be talking about stakeholder journey maps. So what are they and why do you need them? So just to go through some general webinar etiquette before we get started, just to say the session is being recorded. It will be available on demand on the Hart Square website afterwards, but we will also send out a link to that also. You'll see that there is a Q&A box for any questions that you have for any of us on speaking today. Please do send in any questions that you have throughout the session. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, so we will try and get through as many of them as we can. You'll also see there's a chat box, and that's really for more technical support questions or any more general questions for Hart Square. So please put those in there, and my lovely colleague Rebecca is in the background and she'll be keeping an eye on those. So I'm Joyce Harmon, I'm Senior Client Relationship Manager at Hart Square, and I'm delighted to have two of my colleagues with me today, which is a rarity to be able to get two people from their busy schedules. So Ben, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep. Good morning, I'm Ben Peasy. I'm a Client Relationship Manager with Hart Square.
Thanks, Ben. And Michael.
Good morning, I'm Michael Wilcox and I'm a Business Change Consultant with Hart Square.
Fantastic, thank you. So just really quickly, for those of you not aware of Hart Square, just to say that we're a consultancy practice and we work only in the not-for-profit sector. And really the important part of our role is making sure that any of the work and the recommendations that we do, they're based on your needs and your needs only. And very often on a lot of the projects that we work on, we're seen as that trusted, critical friend. So just sort of a brief overview of who we are and what we do. So I want to run a quick poll question just to give us an idea of who's with us today and what sort of stages you're at. So if you bear with me while I bring this up, and I'm just going to launch the poll. So what we're asking are, what stage are you at? So are you seeking more information? That could even be, I don't really know what stakeholder journeys maps are or why I should, do them. I'm not sure where to start. We're currently developing them, or we've actually done them, but we're not sure what to do next, or we're thinking about what to do next. So I'll just give that a few more seconds just to see. I think the seeking more information one is the highest one coming up at the minute, but I'll just give that another second or two. Okay, great. So let me end the poll and I will share the results. So yeah, definitely. So 50%, yeah, looking to seek more information. So hopefully this will give you a good overview of sort of, what they are and why you should consider doing them. And then equally, a lot of people about not sure where to start. And I think interestingly that some of you are along that journey of doing them, and even more interesting, nobody's done them yet. So nobody's finished them. So that's really good. So I think we can definitely focus on the fact that very much everybody here today wants to find out more, is doing them, and see what else we can kind of learn about the benefits of doing them. So if I just stop sharing that. So I'm going to bring in Ben now, who's going to tell us a bit more about sort of stakeholder journey maps in general. Ben.
Thank you, Joyce. So what are stakeholder journey maps? Essentially, these are visual representations of the stakeholders' engagement with you at different stages. Typically through something like a website or an app. So for a lot of you, this engagement could be a supporter going onto your website and maybe attempting to donate or sign up to a newsletter or membership or volunteering. And then, of course, the importance of mapping these interactions is being able to address areas where stakeholders are having a bad experience, which could result in them quitting their action and having a negative perception of your organisation. And then the final point here is that stakeholder journey mapping can be done in two ways. So it can be done internally, or it can be done using a third-party web agency. And for the purpose of this webinar, we'll mainly be focusing on when this is done internally. So now that I've done a bit of an introduction into what a stakeholder journey map is, I'm going to move on to some of the key challenges and benefits. So a big challenge that organisations face can be a lack of understanding over how users interact with you, and it can be unclear where the problems are in the process. So this is where we want to bring some clarity internally by creating a stakeholder journey map. In doing so, we have the benefit of being able to identify areas for improvement, and another benefit being that these findings can also be used to inform the organisation's strategy going forward. So if a user has a bad experience, you'd most likely see a drop in engagement and a potential impact on campaigns and revenue. So if a supporter is feeling frustrated or maybe isolated by these experiences, they're less likely to continue their support. And then the benefits of the stakeholder journey map would be identifying improvements that could increase engagement and revenue by mitigating these bad experiences. And finally, if a stakeholder needs to request help or additional information for next steps, the organisation will receive more unnecessary admin requests. So maybe there's a supporter trying to find out how to make a regular direct debit donation as opposed to a one-off donation, and having to email in to ask because the website instructions are unclear. So here, the benefit of the stakeholder journey map would be that the improvements identified would reduce these inquiries and lead to less admin work. So those are some of the key challenges and benefits. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about personas. Okay, so it's really important to make sure you integrate personas into your stakeholder journey maps. These will help you identify key priorities for different types of user groups. So the personas are fictional characters with characteristics of key stakeholders, and they help you understand really who your intended audience is. So this could be things like the user's demographic, their connection to your cause or service, and their motivations and anxieties. So for example, let's say you're an animal shelter charity, a user persona might be a young professional looking to adopt a dog with their partner to start building a sort of family life together. And maybe they're a bit worried if they're ready to adopt, if they have the right home setup, if they have the right time, something like that. So using different effective personas will allow you to identify the most important functionality for that stakeholder, and also identify the different areas for improvement in the stakeholder journey map that might otherwise be missed. Okay, and now I'm going to hand back to Joyce, who's going to talk through the stages of creating a stakeholder journey map.
Perfect, thanks, Ben. So yeah, really thinking about sort of the key stages at a very high level about putting together these journey maps. And as Ben has already said, the personas, thinking about the users. So, who is going to be using, your product or service, who are they, what sort of type of demographic do they fit into, what are their needs or motivations? And then from that, thinking very much about, the different types of scenarios. Ben has given, some examples about, adopting a dog or an animal, but it could be things like as well, they're, trying to find out more information about you as a membership organization. They're considering becoming a member and they want to find out more information around that, or that they want to become to an event, or they want to find out more information about volunteering. So identify the various different scenarios that there might be about how people interact with you, the type of information that they're trying to get, what is it they're trying to do. And then thinking about on the action. So how do they interact with you? Is this all online? Is it, is it via apps? How do they have those various different interactions with you? And the important bit about interactions is then thinking about the emotions. Because, for example, if somebody's booking on to an event, they go onto the website, they can search and they can find the event that they want. And then they get to the page, and when they click on it, it won't let them book. There's either the page is broken, or there's some error, or it's that they then have to actually email in to finish off the booking. So that will lead to frustration, and definitely thinking about emotions. Frustration is definitely not one of the ones that you want. So by, carrying out these journeys, going along and thinking as if you're that person, what are the emotions you're feeling? How are you finding this interaction is really, really key, because what that leads on then is to opportunities. So thinking about where can we improve things? Is it a case of actually there's some very simple changes that can be done, or is it that these are significant changes that need to be done sort of to the process, to the journey that your members, your stakeholders take? So I'm just going to ask Michael to come in here quickly. This is just an example of a journey map, and although we'll be hearing from Michael a lot more when we get to the interview, but Michael, if you could just give us a sort of a quick overview on this example, please.
Sure, thanks, Joyce. So on that previous slide, there were 5 steps that were very clearly laid out, and this is the visual representation of those 5 steps. So you've heard about the user personas. We're putting that in the top right-hand corner. It's really useful to keep that particular user persona in mind whilst you're doing this. So it's a great idea to have that an image of that person, quick description of of what their goals and motivations are, ever present. So it's just there, and you can be empathetic to that persona all the way through the thinking. Top left, you've got a description of what we're looking at. Now, these journey maps can look at almost any kind of situation. So it's really key to make sure that you are clear on what it is. And one of the reasons for that is that very often this is a group exercise. So you'll have quite a few different people looking at it. And you want to keep them all in the same kind of space, you know, the classic cliche of keep them all on the same page. So those two bits at the top anchor the journey map into the precise scenario and persona you're looking at. And we've got some layers that build up horizontally. We've talked about those. That's the stages of the journey, the user actions. And you can see the emotions piece coming in there that Joyce was just talking about. Quite good to represent that on this kind of graph. And there you can see what's going well and what isn't. And then that area, in terms of what isn't going well for the user emotions part, starts to open up some opportunities. You read them sort of from left to right. So our user persona on this particular journey map is going through, it's a fictitious example of thinking about maybe joining an organization because they've had a word of mouth recommendation. So from left to right, they've got some awareness, they do a search, they start to consider it because the search result gets them to the right site, and they find a case study, and that's really interesting. So they're feeling good about this. Then they think, well, I probably want to join, but what's this, you know, I'd like to try it first before committing fully with some expenditure. So a free trial would be a great option. But at this point, that's when it starts to fall apart for their experience, because for that particular persona, they don't see a free trial option. Now, it may be that you do have one on the site, but it doesn't mean that every type of persona can find it. And that's why you key it into a specific person. And for this person, they can't find it. They start to look around, get a little bit frustrated, and they stop looking at the member organization site, and they go back to just doing a quick Google. And at that point, they end up in a different organization's website because there was a competitor ad at the top. So that's another point on this user map. You might be thinking, how can we improve our website? But what we put together on this illustration is the problem might be in outside of your website. It might be in the advertising strategy of a different organization who nudges ahead of yours by being there in the Google results. So it's just one example, and it's a very simplified example, but we think it's a really good way just to sort of think about the journey map and think about it from a number of different dimensions. Joyce.
Perfect, thanks, Michael. And really interesting, Michael, because we've just had a question come in around, is the focus today just focusing on websites, or is it sort of more holistic than that? But I think absolutely to your point that, yes, a lot of what we're talking today is about websites, but exactly to your point, the issue is not necessarily always the website. It might be some other issues. So yeah, so it all relevant, but not just about websites, taking more of a holistic view on that. So that was a very nicely timed, answer to that question. So really what I just wanted to cover very briefly on this is the sort of how to get started, because the part about identifying your personas, as Michael said, that's really, really important. Having that kind of front and center when you're going through this process, but then you need to think about internally. So as Ben mentioned before, there's kind of two different ways of doing this. A lot of people will bring in web agencies and they will drive this whole process. So really we're just focusing on if you were to do this internally. So the important things you need to think about are who from your organization needs to be involved in doing this. As Michael said, very often it can be bringing together, groups of people doing this all at the same time, but being very clear about who should be involved and what makes sense of who should be involved. But really importantly, who's going to sort of be the champion of this, who's going to be running this whole process, who's going to be managing it, and actually do they have any specific skills that they need in order to be able to do this? And I know definitely have a question for Michael coming up around sort of skills. Then thinking about, the tools, how are you going to do this? If it is focusing on the website, do you want everybody to be in a room, on a laptop, doing tests on the website, testing out these various different journeys? Or is it that you want to be doing lots of different work with post-it notes? Or is it that you want to do this online? There's various different ways about doing it. And we can touch on that a bit more later with Michael, but thinking about how are you going to actually deliver this? What do you need so that when you embark on it, you've got everything ready and you're not going to kind of starting, being paused halfway through. And then thinking about the structure of what those sessions is going to be. Again, who's running them? Very importantly, that you're gathering all of this information. How is it going to be put together? And very importantly, how are you collating all of that? How are you going to identify all the outputs to make sure that you kind of got your clear set of actions? So what is the structure of the team, the people involved in this, in running it, and also taking it through to the next stages? So then you spent all this time, you've gone through and you've got a number of lovely maps, as from the example you've developed, you've spent all this time putting these maps together. But what you don't want is these to turn into shelfware. So you often find, and what we find is when people go through this process, people are highly, highly motivated to fix things, because it's a really interesting exercise to do, because you find a way, things that you didn't know were issues, or that, you think, God, that would absolutely drive me crazy if I was, a stakeholder doing this. Or you go, that's a really easy fix. So you want to be able to grasp that enthusiasm and commit to making changes, because again, my point of this should not just be shelfware. There is no point in spending, time and commitment and some, money around doing this if you're not going to do anything with it. So thinking about that process piece, you need to be very clear that once you do this exercise, the outputs. So for example, you might find that there's some changes might need to be made to the website, or some changes might need to be made to processes, or how inbound inquiries come in. Is there going to be a budget need in order to fix this? What level of investment is needed to fix this? So being very clear right from the start about, if we do, depending on what the outcomes are, who do we need to go through to get approval to be able to go on and fix this? Making sure that that's all been put in place, because it's really, really important that you're very clear that if you find things, that you go away and you do something about them. So I'm going to bring in Michael now, and great to see we've had lots of questions coming in, which is fantastic. But yeah, Michael, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, my background, I started off my career having trained as a graphic designer quite a few years ago. And that was before internet, before digital stuff started happening. So that was design within the publishing world. And I worked for quite a long time at the Wellcome Trust, which was a really great experience. And then gradually the web started to happen, and my work just sort of migrated into that area, because it was all about communication, and it was a natural space to move into. And then after doing a number of different sort of web design, development and management jobs, and working partly in non-profit organizations and partly some commercial, I moved into higher education and worked in a couple of different universities in Kent. I worked at Canterbury Christchurch University and at the University of Kent. A number of different roles. I was in HE probably for about 15 years overall, so I worked a huge variety of different spaces. But digital was always there in the mix, web and learning management systems and CRMs and so on. So it was a really great set of experience. And recently I've moved into consultancy.
Perfect. Well, I say with that amazing background, it makes sense why we've asked you to come in today. So, but based on that experience, what do you find the biggest challenges that clients face, when they're thinking about developing stakeholder maps?
I think it talks slightly to that question that came in earlier. One of the problems can be that if you're thinking, right, I need to do some stakeholder experience maps, or you might hear me talk about them as user experience journey maps, because they come under a number of labels, but they're often called a user experience journey map online. If you're thinking that's where I need to start now, what should I do with one? It's the wrong way around. They're a tool, they're a model, they're a framework, but they help you solve problems. So the first situation, well, they help you solve problems, or they help you do some thinking, typically about a problem. So the first step is to be really clear about what issue or problem you're trying to solve. And then it's a consideration as to whether a stakeholder map is a good fit for that. We talked earlier about websites. They're very commonly used in website designs and redesigns, but that's not the only area they can be used. And they can be a fantastic tool, as I said, to get a whole load of people together who perhaps don't normally have the opportunity to share some thinking about a problem. And so in terms of the question being about a challenge clients face when thinking about developing the map, it's really think about the problems you're trying to deal with, think about getting the right people together, and then is a map the right way to analyze those problems and come up with some actionable outcomes.
I really like that. Yeah, being clear what the problem you're trying to solve is from the start, rather than just straight away jumping into let's do a map. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, as we know, as I said before, that they shouldn't be shelfware. The map shouldn't be seen as an isolated project. How should they be used to feed into, the organizational strategy or sort of strategic planning?
It depends a little bit on the situation that you're using the map to analyze. So it may be that you're looking at it from an operational perspective, in which case the map, we saw that example earlier with about 4 layers. You can have many more layers if need be. So a quick piece about operational assessment. If you're thinking, how do we support our users, our clients, whoever they are, how do we support them best? Then you might have layers that go, what does that user experience? And then how do our staff and our colleagues interact with those users? And you might be using different channels. And so you can build out a map that's really quite large and starts to sort of map out the service design of your organization. That's really all quite operational. And what would come out of that in terms of planning could be a whole sequence of actions that you can take away to try and improve the service that you're delivering. It could be insight that helps you to determine where you need more investment, where you might need to change a system or rework some business processes. So in that respect, I think it can really help with operational planning. On the more strategic side, I've seen it work really successfully when a major new initiative was being started. The specific example, which I thought was really interesting, is where 2 different universities were coming together to start up a new medical school. And the requirement was that both universities brought all of their assets and great ways of working, brought those together and to work in tandem to deliver this one medical school. Now that's quite a challenge when you think about how are we going to roll this out. We've got, whatever it was, 2 or 3 years before the school launches, and we've got people who've never worked together, and we've got to bring them together, join up business processes from 2 different large organizations. So it was highly strategic, and it was all-day workshops. Everyone who had some insight involved, user journey experience maps that were massive. They were meters long, many depths deep. In a sense, that was the tool that got people talking and thinking, and it was highly strategic in terms of gaining a really clear shared understanding, setting the vision, helping to make investment cases. So you've got, all the way from operational to strategic and everything in between.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's a great example. So in terms of, talking about getting started, we've talked about personas as well as the maps. Do you have a view on which should be done first, or should they be linked, or how should they be linked together? How should they work together?
I think personas first, if you possibly can, because the ideal scenario is that you have a set of personas that you already have ready. And typically you'd be putting together something in the region of half a dozen personas to try and give you a manageable group that can represent the broad cross-section of all of your users. And it takes time to put that together, because you ought to be doing it collaboratively. You ought to be pulling in some of the research that you have, or maybe even commissioning research, and you need to be also gaining some insight from the people around you. So ideally, you've got the personas in place, and you can start off and say, right, so on this user journey map, we're going to use persona 1, and maybe we'll run it again, but we'll do it with persona 3 and see if we get different outcomes. If you haven't got personas ready to go, then it's not an absolute blocker, but I think you'll need to sort of work fairly quickly to create some models that can represent your users.
No, and I really like your point as well about a manageable amount. Don't go overboard with the amount of your personas, because you'll never complete the task if you just endless.
Absolutely. Just to note, we go into that. There's an article I think coming out next week on the Hart Square website where we go into some of the detail around user personas.
Oh, fantastic! We'll make sure to send out a link to that once it's published. Thinking about the people who's got the person or people who's going to be leading this, are there any particular skills that they need?
Yes, it's a typical kind of facilitation skills. So if you've got anybody who's good at facilitating workshops, this is if we're thinking about the model where it's internal and you are bringing together colleagues from your teams and hopefully other teams as well, then what you want is that kind of facilitator, and they need to be good at listening. They need to be good at observing how their colleagues are interacting. They need to be able to bring along somebody who doesn't quite understand the concept, and they need to also, you've always got that enthusiastic person who's racing ahead, and you want somebody who can bring the whole team together at the same kind of pace through the work you'll be going through. I would also say somebody who's very good at planning, because you do need to think about this before you're doing it, Bruce. I think you said this earlier, but you've really got to plan it out in advance. And then finally, another piece I would suggest is somebody who's good at the follow-up as well. So picking up on that point about when you've got the team together, when they start realizing or just seeing where all of these opportunities are, it does create a great deal of motivation. The end result of all of this is not a map. I mean, that's just a tool to get you through a bit of thinking. So the end result is typically a whole load of potential things you can do, and what you really want to make sure is you get follow through on that you get somebody who can keep it moving once the session's finished, and as you say, avoid that shelfware situation. So somebody who's really good at the follow through, I think, is useful too.
Yeah, perfect. And then, thinking, is there a particular sort of format or tools that you'd recommend when you're running and facilitating these sessions? When you've done the past, is there anything in particular that you think that would be useful?
Yeah, they run in two ways, because we've got the physical or the virtual in the world of work these days. So in that physical space, it's the classic, you've got to have loads of post-it notes. You're going to have your whiteboard markers. If you can, big whiteboards are great, especially because post-it notes tend to stick to those and not fall off. If you can't, you want lots of sort of flip chart paper that you can stick up. Make it quite big, I think, too, if you're in this physical space. So imagine you've got maybe 5 people huddled together. You want them looking at something that's wide enough and tall enough that they can access it from sort of lots of different angles without bumping into each other. So you also want to think a little bit about the skeleton of it, the sort of design skeleton of it, if you like. We saw that example earlier. It had rows and it had columns. So you would just want in your mind to be able to think, right, if I've got my bit of sort of flip chart paper that is X height, then I'm going to split it into 5 equal divisions so that I can make sure there's enough space for each of these pieces of analysis that we want to add to the map. That's physical. Then if we're doing it in the virtual world, you'll need to sort of replicate that virtually. So that would be about using some collaboration software, the classic whiteboard options that are out there, and there are things like Mural and Miro and so on. But those have all been designed to mimic that physical space. So I would recommend getting set up with one of those kind of things. And I think also in terms of the prep, really do think it through in advance. Maybe even if you can do a sort of practice session before you do it by bringing everyone together. You know, if you brought a lot of people together in a room, that's expensive. That is using up their time, and everyone's time is really valuable, and you've got a real commitment from those people. So if at all possible, if this is your first time, I'd highly recommend trying to just grab one colleague perhaps and just run through, do a dress rehearsal, see what works and what doesn't work, so that you're fully prepared for when you're doing it with a whole load of people.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, have a practice being very clear, so then you're getting more buy-in, isn't it, then when you actually come to the session. So with, as I say, with that example, and actually the example you gave about those, you know, the two colleges merging, there can be lots of different levels of complexity on the maps. So do you have a view on, you know, how simple or how complex or they should be? I mean, I know it can vary, but yeah, sort of what would your view on that be?
It's a great question, but the answer is slightly kind of one of those "it depends" answers. So in that example with the two unis coming together to figure out how to do this great big new initiative, it was a big, complicated thing at the end of the day, but that kind of didn't matter. I mean, we just took photos of it and we were able to reference back to it if we needed to. But the output of that whole day was realized through some of the plans that were put together, some of the strategic plans and the scheduling plans and that kind of thing, some of the budget requirements as well. So the complexity that went into the map kind of carried forwards and was useful after the map, if you like. So it didn't kind of matter that the map was massively complex. I would generally say if you're going to try and do something where if you feel there's some value in producing an actual version of the map that you're going to share with colleagues, then I'd keep it quite simple. I have seen some where it looks like a designer has spent a couple of weeks really refining this piece, and I'm not sure if there is value in that. As I said earlier, I think the value is in the actionable outcomes that you get rather than the map itself. So simplicity in that map, I think, is key, because really you want that list of things you're going to go and do as a result of this. Perhaps you need the map to help make the case, in which case you might want to draw it out, but keep it pretty simple. Don't spend hours on that, because that's not really where the value is.
Yeah, very good point. And then thinking about, you know, once the maps have been completed, you know, what next? You know, so how, I know you touched on this briefly, but, you know, how should they be used? And I suppose who should be responsible for making sure that, you know, the findings are acted upon?
I think it's a great question. I touched on this earlier. If you've got a facilitator, I think they've got a really important role here. Either they need to be able to take it forwards, or they need to be really clear. If you've done this as a group, by the way, doing it as a group, one of the things I found really interesting was to do it as part of a team building sort of away day piece. You know, people get a great opportunity to reflect on how things are working. So if you imagine in that scenario, you know, it's an away day. You're not being asked to produce something necessarily in an away day that has a follow-up. Very typically, you know, they tend to be self-contained pieces, and yet this exercise could produce a whole load of enthusiasm to do some change. So I think you've got to make sure that change has a fighting chance of happening. The facilitator takes a role here, but perhaps it's not all on them. Perhaps that facilitator can say, right, let's share out the actions. Some of them, you know, we don't need to seek permission or a budget or anything like that. We can just crack on. In which case, give those actions an owner, and you know, get some commitment to making them happen. Those ones that are bigger, you know, where you've got to take them perhaps up the chain, senior management, have that kind of discussion, then get somebody who's in a position to be able to do that. Make sure they've got the tools to be able to do that. If they need something written up, you know, help them to do that. And then report back, because you've just created a group of enthusiastic people who really want to see some change happen. And I think there is a duty to report back to that group, because they're going to remember this session. You know, and a few months later they'll be going, whatever happened to the idea we had about changing that widget there? You know, keep them in the loop, keep the whole thing alive beyond the session that created the map.
No, I completely agree. It's the same as kind of, you know, even with journey maps or doing business process reviews or anything like that. If you don't feed back to people, they're not going to want to engage in any other future activities or anything like that. It's really, really important that people know what's happened as a result of that. So yeah, absolutely agree. We've had some great questions come in, so I'll get to them in a sec. So I suppose the final one on this before we come to the questions from the delegates is top tips. You know, what would be your top tips for anybody who's thinking about either going to be the person championing this internally or the person doing them? What would be your top tips?
Yeah, I did think about this. So we've touched on one already, but I'm going to repeat it because it's so valuable. And that is the practice in advance piece. A really, really good thing to run through if you're facilitating one of these. Really make sure you've practiced it because it just makes the world of difference. Then I would also say there's some absolutely fantastic inspiration online. So do a bit of research in advance as well. I found it really useful if you're Googling, other search engines are available, to look for the keywords user experience journey map. That brings up some great results. I would say when you're doing that, ignore all of the commercial results that pop up. There are companies out there now who are, you know, selling services and products that will create this for you. Go past all of that. Get into the blogs of consultancies and agencies and individuals who have done a whole load of these, and you can see some great insights from those people. So there's some really, really good inspiration out there. And then I think the final piece is don't be afraid to adapt and adopt this to wherever you are. That, you know, this is just a model, and no model is ever accurate, but it's a way to get you thinking about the world. And if in your scenario you need to add a layer in to cover something off, then go for it, because, you know, there are no rules about how these work. So you can absolutely adapt and adopt to suit the situation you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like your point about, you know, the free collateral and information that's out there, because you're absolutely right. And as I say, you know, there's an article that you're doing next week, and I know there's ones that you've done around this topic, and hence why we originally started talking to you about this, Michael. But absolutely that there is some great information out there. So, you know, go out and search for it and use it. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that we've had to come in. So one of the first one was, when I did some stakeholder maps in the past, they were so complex because of the touch points and the options along the journey, they did become shelfware, as you put it. How can you make sure that complexity doesn't derail you? I think that's a really good question. So how can you avoid complexity derailing you?
That is a great question. They can get complex, especially if you've done it with a group and you've got lots of people with lots of ideas. You know, that builds and builds and builds, and before you know it, your wall is absolutely covered in loads of ideas. I think one of the things I'd say is observing that situation take place. I think one of the great things that happened was I saw people talking together who'd normally never really had the chance to talk together. It's a difficult thing to capture, but I saw one person go, how can we improve what we send over to you on a monthly basis? And the other person saying, yeah, I know you send that to me on a monthly basis, and I don't know why you send it to me. I've never really been entirely sure. And it's a classic piece, I think, where you've just got processes that are happening and they're not questioned because people aren't given the opportunity. This kind of session can make that happen. So even if it feels like you've ended up with a really complex map, I think there can still be things happening within the discussions that are really, really valuable. However, what I did find worked really well, and it was an idea from the very first time I was introduced to user experience journey maps or stakeholder journey maps, was after the mapping had been done, that we did stand back and looked at this thing, and it was hugely complicated. The facilitator had a thread, like a red, like some wool or something, and had a pin at the top, and opened up a discussion about finding, had two of them actually, I think there was a red one and a green one. So the red one was what they called the pit of despair. And this was going from left to right along the whole piece and saying, let's identify the worst bit in this whole map. Where is it going deeply wrong? And that got pinned and gave a real focus to that area. And to add, to the other side of that coin, the green thread was for a moment of delight. And so that, again, you go from left to right and you have a group discussion and you find where it's going really well. So that allowed some focus to be brought to what was really a big complicated map. And it allowed a discussion to then zoom right in and go, right, well, let's take some learning from the moment of delight. Perhaps there are things there that we can replicate. And let's dive into that pit of despair and make sure we've got some real focus on that and a way to solve that particular problem. So it's a great way to bring some focus into what might be a complex map.
I really love that. I love that the idea of the two pieces of thread in two different colors. It's so simple, but it's really, really effective. I really like that. And yeah, and try not to have many pits of despair. So one of the other questions is, can this work help us to identify missing services and products or services that we could be delivering? I think that's definitely an interesting question. I don't know what your view on that one is.
Yeah, I'm sure it could. Missing services, missing products. I suppose yes. If you're looking at your personas and thinking, right, what does this person need, and you're thinking about if you've managed to put together a full persona, that will list out the goals and objectives of that individual, and what they need to achieve and what they're worried about. So if you are then going through a journey map and you're finding that it's not meeting those goals for that particular persona, why not? That becomes your opportunity. So I think that one probably ties into the analysis around personas quite tightly, because you can look across the personas and go, look, we're brilliant at servicing our really experienced members or users or donors or whoever they may be. Somebody where you've got a great relationship, they know how your organization works, and there's a good interaction. And you might find another persona who's coming for the first time to try and understand your organization. Your persona should say what their goals are, and then you can look at the way that your service is mapped out or that your website is organized and go, are we really meeting their needs? And I think in a sense, that example that we had earlier from on the slides showed a little bit of that happening. We had somebody who in that particular scenario was thinking about whether they would join this member association. And what they needed was a free trial. Now, I think in that particular example, they couldn't find it. Perhaps it wasn't there. So that gives you then, a really great opportunity to think, well, perhaps we should do a free trial. How can we organize it? And not only that, but how can we make sure it's visible to the right person at the right time?
Yeah, that's really good. Really interesting question. I'm glad that one came in. Another question is, if we do this in relation to changing our website, how often or when should we revisit the personas and mapping? Another good question. Great questions this morning.
Great question. I think in a sense the question answers itself, because it's suggesting you should do it on a frequent basis, and I would agree with that. Try and do it on regularly. So I suppose you start off with, can we do it at least once a year? But perhaps it's something that could be pulled in. Quarterly would spring to mind as a good idea. You've got hopefully you've got a sort of regular consideration about your website in terms of your content strategy, in terms of how you're meeting those goals. But it could be a useful thing to especially if you start to do it on a frequent basis, you'll become really good at doing these. So you could do it on a quarterly basis, and you could plan out particular areas to look at, and those areas, you can use whatever information is around you to decide which specific scenario to examine. So perhaps you can talk to the people offering support and ask them, what is the biggest problem that you're having to deal with on the support desk? And then take that as a scenario and try and work it through, so that if you can build some improvements into the site And you could even then stick some metrics on that and go, right, well, we did our first quarterly piece on that in the spring, and we looked at improving this big problem that the support desk were always having to answer. Come back to it in the autumn and go, has it changed? Have we made a difference to this? So, you can see how you could sort of build it in on a regular basis, plan to look at areas that have got a reason behind them to be looked at. It might be new services, new products. It might be problems within the site. There's a whole range of ways of looking at it. And then you can also potentially build in some metrics to that as well, so that you can see if we've done some regular improvements.
Perfect, thank you. Another one we briefly touched on, have you encountered any problems with getting buy-in from the senior management team, on why we should be allocating, time and resources, to do this piece of work? Sort of, have you come across that? And I suppose any sort of advice or tips on how to try and get buy-in for it, I suppose?
I have normally found it worked really well with senior management when this was done as part of something like team away days, because they tended not to be too interested in the agendas and the detail of what was going on in those environments, but they were really interested in suggestions coming out that were based on some good analysis. And so it tended to work pretty well to be able to say, look, we've done this analysis, we've done this mapping, we've brought all these people together, here's how we did it, here's the suggestions, and potentially here's how we can come back and measure that improvement in the future. So it typically seemed to have an open door in the way that was being done. I've also seen it when it's been introduced by consultants. That can work really well. In the case of that medical school example I talked about, that was being facilitated by some external consultants, and in that scenario, it was a fantastic visual device to get the talking going, and so there was a lot of agreement that it would be a good way to work, and it worked better than anyone could have expected. I don't know if that fully answers the question, because I think it was about, are there some barriers from senior management?
No, I think it does, but it's always one of those things, isn't it? It's just getting people to buy into why these things should be done.
Yeah. I think actually that's a really good way of thinking about it. It's not the map. Don't ask, can we go and do some maps? It's about the actionable outcomes or the actionable outputs, whichever way you're organizing it. It's about getting something actionable at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so that's what can get approval from senior managers. It might be a harder sell to say, we're going to do these maps, and it's like there will be fear about those becoming shelfware. But if you can say, we're going to do some analysis and come up with some actionable outcomes that will improve an area, a service, a website, then I think you get the backing.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I'm conscious of time. So one other question, Michael, you might not like me for this one, but I think it's an interesting one. So you mentioned previously a few types of engagement that you might use for journey mapping. I work for a charity, and this is all new to me. Can you explain some of the specific types of interactions or engagements that we should be mapping? So don't worry, I'm not asking you to go through endless lists of things, but I suppose thinking about sort of, a charity or just some sort of organization, is there sort of some key things that off the top of your head you think that you should be looking at, or is it just it's too difficult to say and it's individual per organization?
It's per organization and it is individual, and I think it is about starting off not necessarily with the map itself, but what you might start off with are some maybe there are some KPIs that are important in your organization. It could be level of donations, it could be number of sign-ups, it could be visitors to the site if it's a website, or it could be number of visitors that get through a particular user funnel. So you could pick some kind of KPI that is important in your organization, do some analysis then about the user when they're having an interaction that relates to that KPI, because it's all about looking at it from that user's perspective. And you'll find those areas where it's not working as well for them as it could be. And I think, one way to think about it is when we've all had those experiences when we're the customer, or when we're the client, or when we're the user of some system or some app or a phone line, whatever it might be, we from the outside, we can see really easily when there's a problem with how that organization has set things up. We can see when their processes don't work. From the customer's perspective, it's really obvious. So this is how you can get that kind of view. And I think if you perhaps tie it into some of those KPIs that matter to your organization, that could be a really useful way to start. I hope that.
Yeah, I know that definitely helps. One thing thinking, and this is some questions, but also some that's just occurred to me as well. Thinking about the, when you're actually doing these, and if you're focusing just say on one scenario, how long should they be? Because I imagine it could be one of those things that you could spend far too short a time, or you could absolutely get overkill and get carried away. Like, is there, if you were going in to do this, is there sort of a set amount of time you would say that would be your starting point? Is there, because I suppose, is there a kind of an amount of time you think is sort of the ideal, at least to be thinking about when planning this?
Yeah, I think you'd struggle to get everything done within an hour. They do take a little bit of time, so you probably want to allow at least a couple of hours. That's quite a long time for a group of people just to be focused on something. So maybe you build in a break, and that becomes sort of 2.5 hours, 3 hours. So you start to think maybe we can have half a day at this. And if you've got that kind of length of time, then you can chunk it up, manage the time carefully. But I think time's only one of the aspects to think about. So you will, if you're producing the map, and it's basically, if it's still empty, and people aren't getting the ideas and aren't understanding how to fill it, you need to keep going until you have got something in there. If what more often happens is people get really enthusiastic and it starts to be full very quickly, then you need to slow things down a bit, perhaps put the brakes on at a particular point and go, right, we've made a mess, let's all pause, let's have a little bit of a tidy up session. Because if different people have been putting post-it notes on, for example, then you'll want to do a little bit of, right, well, look, those 5 more or less are covering the same thing. So let's consolidate those into one and have a bit of a tidy up. So give it a good chunk of time, but then as you're going through the process, if you need to, if the map is still blank, you need to kind of push the accelerator a bit and encourage people to start adding. And if they're adding too many, then you need to apply the brakes a little bit and try and maybe use tips like consolidation to clean it up a bit.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Basically, sort of a bit of a tidy up, a sort of a stop point to make sure, are we on track, or has everybody just got carried away with enthusiasm, which, as you say, can happen, because these are really good, they're fun sessions to do as well, and I really liked your point earlier about, taking the opportunity to do at away days and things like that. They're a really good group bonding exercise as well. It's a way of getting people together. I'm just very conscious of time. One really last sort of quick question: when you've developed all the different personas, can it often be that you kind of get to the end of doing the journey, and that it turns out actually we've missed some personas? Is that something that can happen, or is it that everybody thinks the personas, we've identified them at the start and they're the only ones we're going to think about? Is it common that you'll come to the end of it and go, we've missed something?
Yes. I don't know if it's common, but it's totally possible that you've missed something. And I think the world changes, situations change, organizations change. So it's really good idea to keep that group of personas under review. Don't see them as set in concrete. If you start introducing new services, you might be targeting a whole new area. I'm sort of hesitating to use the word demographics. That's not always the best way necessarily to think about it. But you've got a new service, could be a new group. Does it fit your personas, or do you need to think about changing them? And I think often I've seen it where the digital agency, if you're doing it with them, they'll do some research, come back with a group of personas, but typically they won't they'll think they've covered it all, but when you've analysed back and had a chance to think about it, it's like, yeah, there's this one particular one. It's a very small group, but it's a really important group, for example. And we do need to hold that one in there, because although they're not making up perhaps a lot of traffic. You know, they're highly influential. And we've really got to think about how we serve that group as well. So yeah, it can't be set in stone, absolutely.
Perfect. And I'm definitely conscious of time doing my project management head to make sure we keep on to time. We have had another question come in, definitely Michael, people want an answer on how many is the ideal number to do, but I'm going to wait until your article comes out next week and then we'll send that out to people. So just really to say, you know, Michael, thank you so much. That has been really, really insightful. I could talk to you about this all day long, and some really, really good, you know, tips around it. So, you know, thank you very much for, you know, taking the time, and for Ben as well. I both know both of your diaries are quite chock-a-block, so I do appreciate you taking the time
Absolute
today.
pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
And then also, just as you can see here, we are carrying out our research study. We do this every couple of years, and it's really for us to kind of understand what's happening within the market, thinking about, you know, digital projects and what's making them succeed or not succeed. So we'd be really, really grateful if any of you joining us this morning could take the time to fill this in. We will then share the results out with everybody who does fill it in advance of being published. But it's a really, really useful and insightful. So if you could take the time, we would really appreciate it. So I'll just again take the time to say thank you very much to Michael and Ben for joining me this morning, and hopefully we will see you again shortly on another session.